Good evening, everyone. I'm Katharine Ellis. I'm 1684 Professor of Music here in Cambridge and a Fellow of Selwyn College. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session of the Alumni Festival. As you can see, we are in King's College Chapel. We are socially distanced in a way that none of us has been before. Many of you will have come here for the Come and Sing evenings as part of these very same alumni festivals. We're sorry we can't invite you in person to be part of such an event this evening, but it's a real delight to be able to bring you this discussion session about music, about singing, and about Cambridge, all in this iconic building. This chapel was built in the 15th century, and choirs have sung here ever since, as indeed they've sung in chapels right across Cambridge. Our singers are vital to Cambridge. They help us both to celebrate and to mourn. And just at the moment when we've needed them most over the last few months, our chapels have been silent. But at the same time, our students have learnt to sing in different ways and through novel technological means. It's been an incredibly difficult time for everyone all over the world, but we're excited that our students are returning and plans are taking shape to welcome them safely back to our chapels. Here to discuss choral singing at Cambridge and beyond, and to take your questions, are four directors of music. Daniel Hyde first came to Cambridge after winning an organ scholarship to this very college. He was formerly Director of Music at Jesus Cambridge and Informator Choristarum at Magdalen, Oxford, before moving to New York, where he became Organist and Director of Music at St. Thomas Church, 5th Avenue. Last year, he returned to Cambridge and to King's College as Director of Music. Sarah MacDonald is an alumna of Robinson College, where she too was an organ scholar. In 1999, she became the first woman to hold a Director of Music post in an Oxbridge chapel when she took up the role at Selwyn. She also directs the Ely Girls Cathedral Choir and has her own connection to St. Thomas 5th Avenue, where she was director of the annual Girl Chorister course for its first 10 years. Graham Ross studied at Clare College and has been its Director of Music since 2010. He's conducted orchestras and ensembles all over the world and is the founder and principal conductor of the Dimitri Ensemble. Finally, and last but not least, Matthew Martin, Cambridge's most recent Director of Music, who commenced his role as presenter and Director of College Music at Gonville and Caius earlier this year. Matthew was previously Director of Music at Keble College, Oxford. He's a talented composer, and the first disc of his choral music, Jubilate Deo, was in fact conducted by Daniel Hyde. We will structure this evening as two banks of discussion of around 20 minutes with your questions in between. So without further ado, let's think about crisis and adaptation, about what happened, what went through your minds in March when it became clear that your choirs were not going to be able to run as they had hitherto. And I wonder, Matthew, whether I might start with you, since your position was perhaps rather different from that of everybody else. You might have been expecting a grand crescendo at the end of your time at Keble, and you were denied it.
Yeah, I had a grand diminuendo at the end of my time. I was hoping to take the choir to New York, and that was going to be my swan song, and I'd spent some time, not enough time, writing a Missa Brevis for them to be done in St. Thomas 5th Avenue. And that, some may say, thankfully, has never been performed. It was a slightly odd time to be starting a new job anyway. And so really, my question to myself was how best to engage with this new group of people who I didn't know. I'd met a few of them before, but basically I didn't know the choir, and I wasn't quite sure, whether they were expecting me to be in touch a lot or not very much, and I, was eager to get the balance right, and also was aware that at the time of lockdown, as it began, we were really flooded with a lot of online material, and so I felt the pressure to keep up with the Joneses and fill the void with something. And so we tried to do a couple of little projects, but really I was concerned not to overload the students with a lot of correspondence in a term which was full of uncertainty for them, and Trinity term being the exam term. And at that stage, we weren't quite sure what was going to happen about all of that, so they were very nervous. So I really, as I say, a great question mark appeared in the sky at that point, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. But we, had a couple of Zoom drinks parties, which, were partially successful.
It's that sense of community that is also really important, isn't it?
Yes.
I wonder, Sarah, what was your experience?
Well, it felt really surreal, because I really couldn't believe that something was going to affect us quite as drastically as it did and continues to do. In the space of about 48 hours, I cancelled 2 choir tours, 2 recordings, 3 concerts, the whole of Holy Week and Easter at the cathedral, and the whole of the Easter term here, and indeed at Ely as well. And suddenly, woke up with an empty diary. Well, it wasn't empty, because I did actually take my diary, and instead of erasing things out, I actually crossed them out. And so I have weeks and weeks and weeks of crossings out, so that I can look back 20 years from now and see what I didn't do. That may or may not have been a good idea, but I decided not to erase history, but just to cross it out. I was ready for a couple of weeks off, and I suppose at first it was a bit unexpected, novel, and I was furloughed from Ely, so suddenly I had the whole of the Easter vacation on full salary and nothing to do. But it didn't, I got bored eventually. So we then came up with a fairly full-on chapel program at Selwyn, which required me learning to do all those little checkerboard choirs with the little people in their little living rooms singing into their phones. And if I never have to do that again, it will still be too soon.
I think we're going to be talking a little bit more about that, so we're not going to let you off the hook just yet. Daniel, you were...
we, like everybody else, everything just sort of came to an abrupt halt. And things got cancelled. Easter Festival, which is a big thing in this college. Ironically, a tour to China, although that had started to look a little bit dubious before March. It was a peculiar time because I suppose just a few terms ahead of Matthew, I felt I'd sort of just started to get into my stride here in terms of getting the rhythm of a new place and so on. But perhaps most importantly, the singers in King's College Choir were just getting a sense of me. So we were all still in the getting to know you phase. And then, like everybody else, they just had to disperse and disappear. Although we did have the children in school, and I was a little slow to catch on to Zoom. I thought I'd wait and watch what other people did, but we did a lot of chorister work over Zoom. But it felt surreal, and certainly to begin with, it was a sort of a period of mourning, really. And then I realized these wonderful things called weekends. So sort of mixed bag, really.
Graham, you wrote about a choir in tears and a Bach tour that wasn't going to happen. It was obviously traumatic.
I mean, like Dan said, it was, I think for all of us, it was a period of mourning, and that lasted for some people for long times, and other people got over it quicker. But certainly for my students at Clare, we had the very final service of term, a commemoration of benefactor service was cancelled. And the day after, we were due to go on tour to Iceland and then give a performance of the St. Matthew Passion in the Netherlands. And of course, this all fell through. And so I think the hardest thing was the fact that our very last service together, which of course none of us knew at the time it was to be our last service together, was the last time that I saw my choir of 2019, 2020 together. And, you know, some of them are from other countries and they've subsequently gone back home. And so they haven't seen each other in the flesh since. And it's a very strange way to finish a year. It's one thing being 35. I think it's another thing being 21 and you're just about to head to your graduation and suddenly everything moves online. But there have been good things to come from it, including the discovery of weekends, gardens, gins and tonics and all those things. Yeah.
Zoom cocktails.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. So, you know, you've got through the anger element of grief and you begin to have some sense of acceptance, etc. I think it's perhaps not too unfair to all of you to say that there is a healthy spirit of competition between directors of music across Oxford and Cambridge, and I wonder, did that change into something else as you all realized you were in the same boat and you were all, you know, having to foster this sense of musical community, also having a liturgy to service, and, you know, to have your college communities to service as well. So, I mean, was there a sense of esprit de corps which suddenly appeared out of nowhere?
I think there was. I think it exists anyway. Yes, we are, I think, in healthy competition. We know we're looking in the same pool of candidates. But there was immediately a great sharing of experience, and I think that is something that perhaps we've all experienced at Cambridge in normal times. You know, we don't necessarily express ourselves in that way normally, and so people were very helpful to each other as to how they might grapple with all this technology, and whether something they'd tried didn't actually work very well, people would share that information quite quickly, I think. So there was probably an improved sense of esprit de corps, I'd say.
We also had the time to talk to one another, which doesn't, you know, always happen in the general run of things.
And I think for the students as well, I think the students had the chance to talk to each other out, you know, choir members from one choir talking to another choir, and every college was doing different things as to how to bring their students together. But we were all in the same boat, whether you're a student or teacher or whatever.
We had more directors of music meetings over the past 6 months than we've had, I think, in the past 6 years. And we had a sort of Google Doc when we were sharing processes and really simple things like, you know, which colleges, I mean, obviously some students remained in colleges, you know, postgraduates and those who couldn't go home and that sort of thing. And which colleges were doing what for those students. For example, was your music practice room open for anyone? And we were able to help with those sorts of things as well. And I think all of us, I did hear one lovely sort of metaphor, well, it's just been said, this thing about being in the same boat. The brilliant way of putting that was actually we weren't all in the same boat across the world. We were all in the same storm. We were in quite different boats at times, but those of us, you know, sort of waving our flags from, you know, one ship to the other, were able to say, well, you might try this because this has helped our group, and you know, and so it was, yeah. And I mean, we are in competition with each other, but I think actually on the whole we're quite good friends as well. So.
What was the greatest challenge of you each? I think decided to do slightly different things in terms of what you did online. But Sarah, you went for you did go for the little cigarette card option. You know, what was the greatest challenge of doing that?
The greatest challenge was still uploading and downloading files at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then the technology breaking at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then you know, spending 16 hours editing, and the file still sounded terrible. And that actually probably was the greatest challenge, because I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never edited a video in my life, and the extent of my ability with sound editing, apart from being able to tell my recording engineer what I like and what I don't like, was basically clipping the sermon off a SoundCloud file and putting the anthem on Facebook. That was the extent of my ability. And I'm now like actually quite good at making movies. I had to learn that all. I mean, the amount, especially the first 2 weeks, the amount of time I spent on Google going, how do you do this in this? And it was, there were a number of sleepless nights, and I know I'm not the only one. And many of my friends who learned how to do that, clerics and musicians, had no sleep for a long time.
Did any of you have that experience before you actually started?
No, I still don't to this day, actually. But for different reasons, we decided just not to do that, because, you know, we don't have a choir entirely of adults, all those sort of things. And I sort of watch other people doing it and think, oh, maybe I've missed a trick there, because, you know, it's a skill that is going to be necessary. That may be something we come on to talk about in the future. But
I wonder how these artifacts will be viewed in years to come.
Yeah, we are.
You know,
as snapshots of 2020.
Go back to them. Yeah.
I think it's one of the things we did at Clare was just a very simple thing, which was, as Matthew was saying, was to keep in touch with our students, which was for purely non-musical reasons, just simply from a kind of helping them through this time together. And so we consciously had, you know, online meetings and you know, try to be sociable and have drinks and things, and keep some sense of regularity to it, but not so regular that no one had anything to say to each other, because no one had actually done anything different for the last week. And one of the things we did at Clare, in addition to that, was to try and keep the sense of our collegiate community together. And I think that's been something that I'm really looking forward to getting back, albeit in this strange new way. But we posted it was a very simple thing. We just put together a podcast with the Dean, and that went out simply to the college community for some prayers, some reflection, some music which was taken from our discography, and it was a chance to bring people together, and people recorded collects and readings from their kitchens and living rooms and things. And actually it was rather kind of primitive and homegrown, but it felt like we were still being able to do something that resembled perhaps a weekly cycle like we might see in our chapels.
It raises the question of how it was for the students, so diasporic, as you say, in their living rooms, in their kitchens, singing in a way that must have felt so exposed. Did you get any feedback from them as to how they felt about that? You know, both as they were doing it, or, you know, the prospect of doing it, and then after they saw what all of you had done to put the montage together, and they realized that suddenly there's a blend.
I mean, the harsh reality of it is the realization that when you're in a group of 30, that's great, and you can get away with quite a lot. But when it's you and your iPhone and you're submitting that to your director of music, and they're listening to every single note that you've sung, it sometimes raised some eyebrows. But it was, we all did the things that we could do.
I didn't quite realize how reticent some of them were about that. And I think they all thought that I was listening to their tracks. But in fact, we had a keen tenor who was putting it all together, and I wasn't hearing it at all. So I had to, the second one we did, we only did two. The second one we did, I had to write to them expressly to say, I'm not listening to this. So
there was a lot of feedback at Selwyn, and it was funny. There were two things. Firstly, I did an entire little montage of some of the feedback that they forgot not to send me, which is definitely not broadcastable further than just to the choir. But some very funny outtakes. But the other thing was just, I had this strange thing where I was spending. I split the choir into teams, and so we had Team A and Team B, and they alternated every Sunday, and they sang an introit and an anthem and a psalm. And the song was just plain song with two of them. They zoomed it several times, and it actually worked really nicely. But I had spent so many hours every week with their faces and their voices in front of me, that when for the last service, we had a proper Zoom meeting, and I found it very strange because they all looked familiar. They were all in exactly the same place, but they were actually talking back to me as well.
I mean, they obviously will have grown from this experience. Do you think they will never want to do this kind of thing again, or did you get a sense that they were actually interested in the technology and actually creating the best file that they could for you, knowing what it was that you wanted?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that the feedback that I got, I mean, like Matthew, we just did 2 of these things at Clare. One was kind of right at the beginning of lockdown, and then one quite a few months later. And that second one was a piece that we would ordinarily sing at graduation. And I wanted to do something for not just my students in Clare, but everyone who was unable to graduate in the normal way this year. And I think being able to do something particularly for their friends who were graduating and who they knew were going to see this video, it's a kind of small gesture that they made in order to make a rather big impact. And in that particular circumstance, we opened it out not just to our undergraduate choir, but to the alumni as well. So we had amazing instrumentalists and singers from all around the world who'd all been at Clare, and you know, I had 200 videos on my laptop, which was grinding to a halt by the time the last ones were coming in. But it was actually a very heartwarming thing to do, and I think they will look back on it as something that they were grateful to do. I don't think they want to do that type of music making for the rest of their lives, but it's certainly better than nothing, I think.
Yeah. And perhaps one final question before we take some questions from our virtual audience. How did your repertoire choices, how were they affected by the technology of either needing to put things online very quickly or indeed needing to construct them from individual voices?
I very carefully chose things that we had recorded before ourselves. And because with instrumental ones, you can do a click track, I think. But with singers, a click track doesn't take into account tuning, which still has to be adjusted to a certain extent in the post-processing. But what I did was take stuff that we had either sung and, you know, on one of those SoundCloud things in a service, or that was on a commercial CD, and used that. I filmed myself conducting my own recording of Selwyn Choir singing it, and that was the guide track. And then they would sing their own part, and that meant that the tuning was okay. And the only thing we didn't do that for was one thing that was accompanied, which we'd never done, which was Grace and Ives' Listen Sweet Dove, and where I did the accompaniment myself, played the accompaniment myself. And then in the guide track, I also played the unaccompanied bits so that they would sing along with those. So although on the videos, it's never, I mean, there was one of some people have said, well, do you just mouth along to someone else's recording or even to your own recording? That never happened. All of those videos, the sound that you hear is being made by people actually on their phones, and it's been glued together. But they were singing, say, the soprano part alone to a piece that was on a previous Selwyn Choir CD.
So I wonder if we can move to questions from our audience. And an early one that came in is a very general one that takes us actually back to the beginning of what we were talking about what you personally miss in these times of no even songs and no singing. Daniel, I wonder if you'd like to lead off on that. You were talking about how wonderful it was to get weekends back.
Yeah.
You're now being asked the opposite.
Well, I'm very much a person of sort of rhythm and order. So to have that sort of timetable removed, I miss that. I think, though, it gave me a lot of time to think about a job that I have been very fortunate to have done in a number of different places. And actually, rather than dwelling on what I sort of missed, it gave me time to think about what perhaps I might do differently when I finally get to go back. You know, it gave me time to nuance some of my own skills. It gave me time to think about the things that I like, but perhaps put up with. Do you know what I mean? I was trying to sort of see it in very much a positive, unscheduled sabbatical. But actually, it's just the rhythm of the thing. If I really missed something, it took me a while to get used to just not doing it. And I certainly expect to find this term that lack of momentum will be the thing that takes the most time to recalibrate, rejuvenate, really. But I sort of miss things, but also saw it as an opportunity to not miss things because I might do them differently at the end.
Matthew, what about you?
I lost count of the number of people who said to me, oh, you must have had so much time for composition. And I didn't write anything at all. I don't know what happened. And I think it's what Dan was saying about the rhythm of it. It disrupted my rhythm so much. And the only thing I could really do was play the piano and practice the organ. But I certainly miss making music with other people, and I, as well as Dan, I took the time, and it was a very good time in a way for me to have this unscheduled sabbatical, because I was able to sort of dip my toe into the water very slowly of this new job and really think about the sorts of things that I might do eventually when I was allowed to come to Cambridge, is to go into the chapel and get a sense of the space such as it is in Caius Chapel, and sort of have a think about what sort of accent the choir might have, rather than being plunged into Trinity term with all of that entails. And so I was sort of grateful for aspects of the space, but I hesitate to say that. But I'm looking forward to getting going.
May I let you into a secret? It's Easter term.
Easter, I know, sorry.
Not
Oxford, right?
In my interview, I kept getting this
sorry.
wrong. I kept referring to tutorials.
Welcome to
They were
Cambridge.
looking at me, sort of saying, what are you talking about? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Welcome to Cambridge.
It's a gaudy weekend, isn't it?
I'm just looking at messages here that have come in. There's one actually, especially Daniel, for you, about the acoustics that we're working with right now, and how much of a challenge they are in real life.
Well, I suppose we're here.
Get back to real life.
We're here in real life now, and of course we're all talking at this great distance, and mindful of the fact that we're microphoned up, so we don't need to speak loudly for the people at home. But I think this acoustic is a very resonant space. It's going to really reveal its challenges when we start up again in real life, because we'll all be distanced. I think that certainly the adults of King's Choir will be standing at about the distance that we're currently sitting. And in this resonant acoustic, that will present all sorts of challenges. They're not entirely clear to me yet what they'll be, because there will be some surprises. I think any kind of resonant acoustic requires people performing within it to listen to each other that little bit closer. I'm forever telling my lot that if you can't hear 2 or 3 other parts, i.e. the other 3 parts, usually in addition to yours, then there might be something wrong. But this is a curious acoustic, because of course now we're sitting in a space where we would actually have chairs and benches. And although you can't see it, the other side of the organ screen, the antechapel, is completely clear of chairs. So we've deliberately done that because we want as much floor space as possible. And the chapel is even more resonant now than it would normally be. But if you want to go to the opposite extreme, you should come on Christmas Eve when it's full, because then of course it's completely dead. So it's a challenge. But I think that any acoustic, I'm sure my colleagues would agree, that the kind of room tells you often how the music needs to go. And certainly this is one of the best stops on the organ. It's one of the best places to sing in many ways, but it also is terrifying at the same time.
You mentioned this question of singers needing to hear other parts. And we have a question here from Tom, who says, I sing in an amateur choir, and while some of our singers are strong enough to do quite well rehearsing by themselves over Zoom, others really do miss the support of a stronger singer in the same space. Any advice? There was the beginnings of something, Sarah, when you were talking about the accompaniment, but I wonder.
It's going to be tough. I mean, you can't lean into your neighbour anymore either. It's even at 2 meters distance, you won't get much help. But I mean, I think firstly the thing is not to panic actually, because we're all in this strange situation together, and lots of stuff is online, which we're getting used to. But I think there's been lots of good things where I think people have been doing these online events where they can't actually hear their singers. So conductors have been taking these sessions where they can't actually hear their choral society, which seems quite strange when you say it like that, but actually they have the ability to hear whatever the conductor's putting out on the audio. Maybe it's a recording, maybe it's them at the keyboard, so that they can simply sing along themselves without the fear of worrying whether they're as confident as their neighbour. But I think I don't know what the ideal solution is really. I mean, we're all dipping our toe in the water, aren't we? I mean, it's
one of the things I found that may be useful is, rather than trying to sing, the words, your own part in your front room, feeling very isolated, if you can hear more clearly what the person taking the choir rehearsal, as Graham says, somebody playing the piano, or maybe putting a recording through Zoom, actually humming rather than singing. I've done that a little bit with my choristers. Just, for those who are a little bit reticent. It's perhaps also that there may be somebody else at home in the next room that they don't want to be overheard by, a sibling or whatever. So just being involved is probably good enough for now.
And another question about quite a few technical questions coming in. Is there any software that allows people to enjoy the experience of making music, whether choral or instrumental, communally, as opposed to the recording of separate tracks which are subsequently spliced together? This is a latency question.
It is a latency question. There are a couple of places that have been working on it. There's and I've seen sort of adverts for it. I mean, I think the crucial thing is that you can't do it over wireless. You've got to have an Ethernet connection. And there is, the most remarkable one I saw was put out by, it was developed by the father of a boy in a children's choir in California. And it was on the Classic FM website. It came up about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And they had, it's this big sort of youth choir or boys choir, and they had a recording of a group of singers, professional singers. So the boys in this choir were missing singing together, but the father, who'd been furloughed from, or whatever the equivalent is in the States, had lots of time and was a techie. And so he started to develop this program. And there was a quite extraordinary demonstration of the software that he developed. So they tried singing the Rachmaninoff Bogorodice Dziewo over Zoom, and it was hilarious, as you can imagine, because it was all at different times, and all the singers got the giggles, and it sounds ridiculous. And they put a video of that up, and then they did it using this wired connection and this new software, and low latency software. And I mean, it wasn't the same as a choir singing, the sort of subtlety of it wasn't there, but it was almost exactly together, and it was utterly astonishing. And it's, everything about it said, this is absolutely legit, this was done from people's different living rooms. But I don't think it's a kind of, thing that you can order on Amazon or whatever.
So you're not going to give us a title for this software?
I can't remember. And I've had to turn my phone off, so I can't. I'll try and tell one of these lovely people over here and put it in the notes on the YouTube link.
I mean, there's a related question about whether anybody's had any successes doing virtual rehearsals. Did any of you try doing virtual rehearsals?
Yes,
you did.
Well, because we weren't producing, I mean, I'm just, the way I hear Sarah talk about producing all this content, I think I'm just amazed by that, because I just know that I would have gone nuts round the twist and back the other side. But we decided, rather than producing the content, that we wanted to try and keep something going for the children of King's Choir. So we took some tech actually out of this building, cameras and mics and so on, and we set it up in the song school at school. And so I was able to take rehearsals from the piano with some children in the room when they were gradually coming back to school, and others on Zoom. And it was an interesting experience, because of course if we had some kids in the room, they could be heard by those at home. So that sort of answered, I think it was Tom's question, just that sense of being involved. And we also started to use some screens. So I could share my screen over Zoom. I found an excuse to buy the latest iPad, which was obviously necessary. And you could share scores. I could write on the score with an Apple Pen and it would appear on their screen. And for the children in the room, we had some screens mounted on the desks. And that was actually very interesting because, of course, some people find it harder to concentrate on paper and constantly moving backwards and forwards. To be able to just present what we were going to do, there it was on the screen, instead of saying, turn to page 5 and look at the third bar. I could circle, say, right here, and just have their attention in different ways. And I thought at the time, you know, this will be fascinating to see how much of this kind of technology we might take away from this experience. I mean, I don't have the iPads ordered yet for the choir here, but it's that idea of whether or not we might move towards using some tech in our educational role, which of course we all have. But rehearsing, the elephant in the room was that you couldn't actually have them all singing at the same time, which is why we need that software. So
Yeah, we need that software soon.
yeah.
And also, most of us have you know, that despite everything that's going on, we are having and wanting to keep going. And so certainly all of the auditions that we would ordinarily be taking, we did manage to do choral trials here. It was about the very last thing before lockdown. And from that point onwards, any other auditions that have taken place since whatever it was, March the something, we've all done them online, and it's not ideal, and you can't play along at the same time as them singing, and they can't sight read with you being able to adapt to what's happening in the room. You certainly can't get them to sing with someone else at the same time, but it does kind of work. And I was doing some of these auditions, and some of those people who I've given a place to, I'll see next week for the first time in real life. And it's a rather strange feeling to think that we've given these wonderful, bright young things these places to come and sing in our choirs in a way that no one has ever auditioned like that before. Let's hope they're good enough.
I saw my choir yesterday for the first time since March, although, well, I don't recognize most of them. And I had done 6 or 7 auditions over Zoom over the past couple of weeks. And the really interesting thing was the sight reading, because I didn't even bother giving them the hard sight reading. I only gave them the easy sight reading, because even doing something that's completely tonal with absolutely no framework, because normally, you know, you'd ask them to sing the alto part and you'd play the other 3 parts, and so they've at least got an idea what key it's in. But you know, it was much harder, even for the ones that you could tell are, you know, they're music students or they're going to be quite experienced. Fortunately, it seems to have worked, and actually they made quite a decent noise yesterday, so that was sort of encouraging. But you know, even simple things like doing the seating, we're sitting at the east end of the chapel, in order to be spaced out on Sundays to allow for some more people in the congregation. And I didn't know where to put them because I had no idea how tall they were, because mostly I'd seen them sitting down on a computer screen.
I'm having this keys trying to make plans without knowing the sort of size or shape or anything.
You don't want
so,
someone like
you know,
me to turn up. You don't want me in your front row.
no, I really don't. Many reasons.
Really don't.
On that note, I have another technical question here. Any tips for amateur choirs trying to record and combine individual videos? For example, would you recommend recording and combining audio first and miming to the playback?
It's tough. I think I mean, the best answer to that question is to try and find someone who's willing to put in the hours to do what Sarah did at Selwyn and to stitch these things together. The 2 projects that I did of this, by far the hardest thing was to make the audio match up, just simply in terms of simple alignment. Because if you were to give each of us a phrase to sing now in a separate room, and even if you were to tell exactly what the tempo was and to set it on the metronome, we would probably do 5 just slightly different performances. And because we're all musical, we'd all perhaps think of one phrase in a different way to someone else. And that's really hard to get that bit together. So I think for me, the hardest thing is to get the audio together. The visuals is an added bonus, but
I suppose you don't have to have the visual. I mean, I haven't done any of this, but if that's, you know, if two things together are problematic, if trying to get an amateur choir to feel they're doing some singing, actually, maybe we will get to the stage soon where we've spent too much time looking at screens and having just an audio file as a feeling of achievement, and this is the work we've done. I don't know, maybe that's the way it'll go. Could be worth thinking about.
And that leads to another question. I think there's a challenge in this question from Garth Wilkinson. Online choir performances must require a lot of post-editing, I think. There's a nod coming from Sarah here. Presumably this must be more difficult the larger the choir, e.g. spem in alium. So who's going to do spem in alium?
There were two.
Two
There've been two
yeah.
done. And I have to say
Actually, yes, I did see one.
They were rather brilliant, but I know from one person who did one of them, it's many cups of tea consumed during the process. But yeah, people have been fantastically ambitious and creative. Yeah.
Yep, the St. John Passion, that's right. That's right.
You know, I'm sure more than one. You know,
I certainly found that the amount of time involved increased exponentially according to the number of singers, and we all know what an exponential increase is these days. And the final service of the Easter term for Selwyn, I actually was allowed to involve the Ely girls, whom I hadn't seen, of course, at all, just for the hymn, because it was Co-Fen, and which is the school hymn at King's Ely as well. And so I had the whole of Selwyn choir, because we had the whole choir for that, plus 18 girl choristers, so that was, you know, 40 odd singers. And that took way more time than doing 12 singers the previous week had done, like ridiculous amount more time. The really crucial thing that I noticed was that you know, even if you you're using a recording that they're singing along to, that they sang on themselves, so they kind of know what I want to do with it, and they've got a video of me conducting it, you know, and there will be all those tiny little differences. And the thing that I found eventually so discouraging about it was that if you've got 30 people in the same room, you know, all you need to do to change something is to catch the eye of that wayward tenor or whatever it is, and suddenly the ensemble fixes itself. And instead, your wayward tenor is, you know, oh, I'll move this little mouse here and up there to here and down here and there here, and, you know, and actually it takes, you know, half an hour to fix one phrase, which, you know, a pinky finger will fix in live performance. And I remember just at one point, after I was getting quite used to doing this and actually feeling quite pleased with the results, something came up that I listened to an actual recording of the choir singing earlier in the year together, much earlier in the year, so they were quite new at the time, but I still remember thinking, my God, real live people in the same room as each other. I really miss that, and I don't want to do it this way anymore.
Spem and Allium has been recorded professionally and commercially by, you know, overlaid by one choir singing over its own recording. I wouldn't tell you where, but it's certainly it's not new.
There was a beautiful performance of it with the BBC Singers and the Danish National Vocal Ensemble, amazingly in their own countries, mixed together. And they played it, didn't they? It was on Radio 3, and I mean, it was really impressive, I have to say, to suddenly have these two groups, you know, 20 each, whatever it was. But I don't think anyone's done a kind of virtual ring cycle yet. Maybe we're still due that.
Put a lot of people out of a job if they did.
I think a final question before we move on to our own second session. This is from Michael Phillips, who is in Austin, Texas. He says, I would be interested to hear the panelists' views on whether the proliferation of regular live webcast choral services across the world is something they see as likely to persist post-COVID.
I would have thought yes. I mean, you know, my parents came to chapel every Sunday in the Easter term, and they live in British Columbia, you know, and so it's not just, you know, the sort of elderly widow down the street who's not going to be able to come to chapel carrying on now because she's, you know, not well enough, and but actually people all over the world, you know, perhaps in some you know, let's find out what's going on here way, but especially the ones who have some kind of connection. And certainly I think we have all invested in, lots of college chapels have invested in webcasting equipment, and certainly I was playing around on it today in Selwyn.
It's changed the way we think about accessibility, I think. And I've been having conversations at Keys over the past couple of months, which I never thought I would be having. But actually, I think it's all for the good. You know, you look at Canterbury Cathedral, and I was talking to the dean there the other day, and, you know, many of us have seen him and his cat saying morning prayer, you know, and he was saying, well, you know, I've never had so many people at morning prayer. You know, it's tens of thousands of people at morning, and they're going to, you know, find ways to kind of keep that going. And so I think it, you know, as Sarah says, I think, you know, many of us have scratched our heads and thought maybe this is the time to start doing something, even in Keys Chapel where we have no acoustic. Perhaps we can add one.
I think also that when we're at a stage when we have this technology still going, but we're hopefully back to what we did before the pandemic, that perhaps those live occasions, concerts, services hold even more importance to us and to the people who are there. And that doesn't stop it being broadcast, and people can sit in British Columbia and listen to it. But for the lucky people who are there, I think we'll listen in different ways, and perhaps as performers, we'll perform in different ways. I think I'm quite mindful of the fact that if cameras are on all the time, that makes for quite a different set of evensongs this coming term, because we usually have a shut door and the people who are in the chapel are listening. But actually, if you know that there's the potential for anyone to listen, I think you have to be careful that you are still true to your performance. And we have to be a little bit careful, I think, for allowing evensong to have mistakes. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but, you know, to allow it to be natural. It shouldn't, in my opinion, it shouldn't be a polished concert every time.
I think it's great the way in which we can all be that bit more accessible, but I think especially here in Cambridge, it's education. That's kind of what we're doing. So slightly warts and all, people are eavesdropping on these things rather than buying the latest CD. But from my experience previously in New York, every service at St. Thomas Fifth Avenue is webcast live and then posted afterwards and is available for re-listening. And it does, Graham's right, it does change, if you allow it to, it changes your working method, because you feel as though there's somebody there all the time in a way that you can cope with something going a little bit amiss live in church. But when you're unsure who's listening, it's a bit like not seeing our audience tonight. You don't know who's there. And it does change the way in which you work. And that is something we're going to have to learn to deal with. But I think our listeners will also learn to appreciate perhaps a little more closely what goes into developing that, you know, Grammy nominated recording.
Yes.
You know, it goes both ways.
More of a sense of not necessarily opening up the backstage, but you would certainly see much more of the mechanics of what is happening. I think we've almost segued into our next bit of discussion about what the future is likely to hold, and you're in a position where you've either just seen your choirs for the first time, or you're just about to see your choirs for the first time in what must seem like a very, very long time. So I wondered if we could talk a little bit about, you know, how you've reached this stage, what kinds of preparation have gone on in order to get you to the first rehearsal with real warm-bodied humans singing to you. Partly this is a question about following the science and the things about social distancing, but there are other aspects of planning. Sarah, you're...
Well, risk assessments. We have all been buried in them. And going through every single thing that a group of people does, and working out what things are actually not going to be possible. So, for example, you know, we have quite a big chapel. I'm very fortunate that way. So we can distance comfortably in there, but our choir vestry isn't big enough. And we can't send them all up there to get changed into their cassocks. So we've had to come up with, you know, all of the students at Selwyn and Newnham have to keep their cassocks in their rooms. Goodness only knows what state they're going to come back looking like at the end of Christmas. You know, sort of going through all of those sorts of procedures, I've purchased masks. Those of you internationally may not realize, but it's in places of worship, face coverings are compulsory, except for when you're actually doing something like preaching or reading or singing. So we now have a beautiful set of matching masks which go with our cassocks and have the Selwyn crest, you know, and we practiced putting them on and walking to our seats and processing in single file, and how to get into our socially distanced seats and how to get out of them again, and when to put the masks on and when to take them off, and you know, all these sorts of things that have absolutely nothing to do with whether the altos are singing in F sharp or in F natural, which is what I learned in my degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of planning. I mean, in some ways, I'm sure we all feel the same. It's a bit like kind of starting again. There's some just really fundamental things that we can't do or we need to do in different ways, and it's going to be an experimental term for all of us. But I'm optimistic that we can find good things from it. Certainly, I know my own singers, I'm really looking forward to seeing them again, and I know that they're kind of bursting with energy to come back. And one of the great things about this place is that the people here they're hungry to have a good go at it and to try to the best of their abilities, and to, you know, to run in from lectures and tutorials and things, and then go into something which hopefully they all love doing, but for lots of them, it's not their academic subject. And so in terms of planning for this term, we've got so many unknowns, and as soon as one person might need to isolate, which potentially might mean they're staircase isolating, which means that maybe you've lost 5 of your 6 sopranos on one side, etc., you know, we will have to overcome those things. But I also think it's important that we, as Dan was saying, you know, this is an educational place, and we're here to teach them. And I think it's important that we don't kind of dumb down simply because it's going to be probably quite difficult. I still think that there's that need to push them and to try and reach the levels that they were doing before we encountered this. Whether it works in practice, I don't know, but it's certainly a huge amount of planning.
Sorry, go on, Matthew.
No, sorry, I'm hoping that it might perhaps unleash a new level of creativity. I don't know about you, Graham, when you're composing, but you know, if I'm told that I can't have various things, you know, I can't use the organ, or I can't write in more than 4 parts, and I'm often annoyed at the time. But you know, often it's a better piece, and I think it's the same with this. There are lots of things, certainly in keys, that I can't do. You know, I'm unlikely to be able to get the whole choir into the chapel, certainly not initially. And so I'm just trying to come up with ideas of different sorts of repertoire, using smaller groups, and got a chamber organ in, and we might do some chant and, you know, pieces in 1 part. And, you know, it sounds as though it might be dull, but actually I think it might be could be something rather magical. And as you say, an opportunity to really work in some detail and teach them.
I wonder how many of you think that what you're planning now is actually going to be what you're doing on the 3rd weekend in November.
I think some of us are, I mean, certainly I am extremely OCD about my music list, and I hate changing it. But I mean, I've written one because that's better than not writing one, but goodness only knows. I think I'll do that cross out thing again, like my diary though. And if it's a plain song, you know, Anglican chant, you know, basses only, when the rest of the choir is self-isolating because somebody has a cold or whatever. So yeah, flexibility may well be the game.
To embrace a challenge, because I would be described as Sarah just described herself, and I haven't planned any music. Instead, I've just looked at Christmas. That's all I've been doing, and just thought. It's been a very interesting opportunity to consider how music could be done in distanced formations, or how one could actually rearrange, get permission and potentially rearrange a well-known version of a carol, but for the reality of how it might have to be. And I've decided that I will just pull some sort of core repertoire off the shelf and just give everyone the kind of, let's see how it's going to go, including myself, so that we're all in the same boat essentially. And as Matthew suggested, that might actually be quite creative, because there's going to be something to teach in there, but it's not my normal way of working.
But then when we put it all together, if we're allowed to do that ever, could be rather exciting.
Yeah.
I think that it opens lots of possible new avenues for repertoire. I mean, like Matthew, we can't fit all of Clare Choir into Clare Chapel unless we have absolutely no congregation, which we are planning to do for a few services. But by and large, we'll have essentially half the choir. But the term that I've planned, which will probably not happen, but the idea is not simply just half the choir and half the choir, but I've tried to shake it up so that we've got different combinations, upper voices, lower voices, some services with instrumentalists, and also remembering, of course, that we've got 10, 12, something like that, new members of the choir, and it's really important that they are given the same kind of process that everyone before them has gone. You can't just not involve them. So there's a kind of pedagogical thing involved in making sure that they are also part of this process that we do. But it's going to be interesting, and I think we should embrace it, as Dan said. I mean, that's the only way to get through the next 8 weeks.
And we've talked a lot about singing. What about your organists?
Well, my two organ scholars, very conveniently, are in the same household, so they can turn pages for each other, and we can do unaccompanied music when neither of them is able to be there. But that has been convenient. And they're just, we don't have to do this thing about air the organ loft for 72 hours before the next one can play or whatever, so.
It's fine until they both have to self-isolate.
Exactly.
So you're going to have all or nothing. Yeah. So it becomes a question of how deep is your squad in footballing terms.
I think they're looking forward to coming back, just like the singers. I mean, I had a lovely email from my senior organ scholar who put in some requests for repertoire, like the singers. He's not been at a console, and it depends on where they live and whether they've got access to a church or, all these things. And I think they're coming back early, consciously, on their own choice, in order to try and get back into things. And we're all going to be kind of just gradually turning the handle again, and but we'll get there.
Mine was so delighted to be able to come and play a real instrument. We've seen so many videos of people playing electronic organs for a long time, so they, even the keys organ, they were delighted to play it, and they've been, spending a long time thinking about how to clean it, and so I bought a bottle of isopropyl alcohol, which I've left up there with some tonic for them.
It's going to be part of the sharing experience of exactly how you wipe down sanitize the organ.
It gets a bit complicated.
Yeah.
But,
Who would have imagined that we would be talking about such things? I wanted to bring us back to the question of the science, because I know you've been sort of following some of the scientific experiments that have been going on to see exactly which wind instruments, brass instruments are dangerous, and how dangerous singing actually is. Is it something that's affected the way that you're thinking, or are you thinking much more about the sort of regulatory side of things?
I think singing has had a really bad luck because the narrative has been so negative, when actually the more recent research, which the government eventually commissioned, has shown that, that's perhaps an unfair narrative that we now have to try and dismantle slightly. But I think the science is tied up in with the administrative sort of procedural side of things, because of course we can't really do anything if we haven't read I think it's 4 different sets of guidelines that conflict with each other. But usefully, in my opinion, everything allows you to assess your own situation and to mitigate risk. And of course, one of those is to do with the science of how close singers can be, what sort of volume we can sing at. That's the other thing to come out.
Ventilation.
Ventilation of space and so on. So they sort of intertwine, but I think we're all very grateful to have Declan Costello's research, because of course, without that, we probably wouldn't be sitting here now, actually. You know?
That was, I think, for me, the most difficult thing about the lockdown, actually, was thinking that was the narrative out there that basically said that my job was a danger to people's health. And I remember, you know, somebody won a Premier League football match or something like that who wasn't supposed to. I'm not quite sure who it was. And all of the fans in the middle of what was still a very strict lockdown got together, thousands of them in the street. First of all, thousands of people in the street when, you know, 30 people couldn't even go to one funeral or whatever, but they were singing, singing. And, you know, and then somebody down the street, the pubs had opened, and there's a pub down the street from me, someone had a birthday, and they sang happy birthday. And so here was all this singing, community singing. I'm totally in favor of community singing. But there they were singing and singing on the news and singing, and everyone was excited about Liverpool winning football. And they were singing and they were singing. And here's me, a professional choral conductor, being told that I was not allowed to have any singing because everyone might die. And then one of my students, who used to be one of my singers, went skydiving. And that was considered safe all over Facebook. And I really struggled with that.
I think the science is going to be helpful to us, though, because it certainly caused us to think about, you know, how we're going to operate. I don't like the idea of having to sing softly all the time, but, you know, it's going to present challenges, but I think it's absolutely imperative that we follow it, because, of course, it's the thing that's going to keep us safe. It's all we know. So we've had to engage with it. For somebody who got a B at GCSE science, I mean, it's been illuminating.
And it's the same for our congregations. I mean, we have a duty of care to them as well in the buildings that we present our services in, and we want them to feel as safe and as welcome in whatever form that might be, whether it's just simply to our own collegiate community, perhaps to start with, and maybe later on to the public. But yeah, I mean, the science has been super important and will continue to be so, I think.
It'll also feed into some of our teaching. You know, there are a number of highly respected visiting teachers who come to Cambridge and teach singing, and of course there's quite a lot of information that we didn't know. I mean, I didn't really know about aerosols so far as singers are concerned, you know, before it was all researched. And I'm sure it will feed into pedagogical study, the idea that you need to know a little bit further about what it is you're doing, not just the physiology of it. Good.
We've got lots of questions, and I suggest that we segue into some of these. Obviously, some people have been asking questions about masks and social distancing. Jean Carnell says several local amateur choirs seem to be restarting with the instruction to wear masks as well as distancing. Do you think it's ever possible to sing in masks?
I haven't tried, but I don't see why it isn't possible. I mean, the point, you know, the regulations are, it's about mitigation and distancing. We're not wearing masks right now because we're far away from each other, because that the risk is mitigated. If we had sat right beside each other, we would be doing this webinar in masks. I think, you know, even just speaking in masks, depending on the mask, sometimes every time you breathe in, you sort of suck it into your face. So that might make the singing difficult, but, you know, it's better to sing than not to sing. So
Uncomfortable, but not impossible for the short term. I think if you wear glasses, it might be a problem, because I couldn't see the music, you know. But
I think the important thing is to also to remember to wear them when you're not doing the singing bit. I mean, I think that's going to be the I suspect, the thing that I'll have to keep reminding my students. And we will process in with masks, and we'll remove them at the beginning of the service, and that will feel strange. But
it's interesting though, because that I have experienced now for a day, and certainly Selwyn Choir, we've said masks must be worn at all times when you're moving around the chapel, and they just put it on. It's fine. They've been absolutely fine. We said it once, and they're just doing it. So.
Yeah. There are some more general questions that are coming in. One which, Sarah, will resonate with you. To what extent have we been able to draw on resources of college or university IT departments in creating virtual choirs? This one from Andrew Sheldrick. What kinds of support structures have you all had in?
Well, I mean, our college and IT and university IT departments have, not surprisingly, been pretty busy trying to make exams happen and trying to make governing body meetings happen. And I will admit that I did it myself with the help of Dr. Google, but I'm sure I could have asked for help, although I don't know that my IT guys know anything necessarily about using Audacity. So.
I think they've all been, yeah.
It's all been a solo effort. Yeah.
No, I don't think it's been so. I mean, there's been many people working behind the scenes, but I think, for example, we're having some cameras installed next door at Clare for some live streaming, and that's obviously, we've had to liaise with our IT teams to, I don't understand any of it, but in order for some cables to connect through to something else, that's why I don't get involved in it. But no, they've been fantastic. And as Sarah says, I mean, certainly from the faculties, I mean, Faculty of Music was all of the exams last term was amazing work. All the people working behind the scenes to make sure this could happen, with students submitting videos and us putting out different forms of exams. I mean, they're all heroic, those people.
It has been a total reinvention, yeah. I think, even perhaps for IT departments, yeah. Because actually doing this in relation to music is not something that they've ever had to do, yeah. Before. And so, and of course we bring particularly acute ears to what we're doing and have particular standards of, what we expect to come out at the end. And yes, these things are, I think there's been a huge amount of teamwork that has been going on behind the scenes. Matthew, was that your experience?
Absolutely. I mean, they had to set me up at Keys with, my Wi-Fi in my office didn't exist before me. So, and then when they did install it, it didn't work. And so there was but they were extremely helpful. And I felt very, very guilty asking them to help me when, everything was crashing down. And as Graham was saying, we're having some webcasting equipment put in as well. And they've just sort of got on with it, and wires are, being drilled through all sorts of, actually not being drilled, I shouldn't say that. They're being sort of temporarily put, sorry. Never mind. So
yeah. There are some more general questions about repertoire coming through. This one from Clare Arden. As a singer who sings in both large-scale choirs, 100 plus, and smaller choirs, say 20 to 30, do you think larger works, e.g. with orchestra, will be viable in the coming year at all? And how do you think this pandemic will lead over time to more, do you think this pandemic will lead over time to more and small amateur choirs rather than large choral societies?
Well, they are happening. They're happening in other countries, which showing that it is perfectly possible to do it and to be safe. And there are large-scale works being put on with distanced orchestra and distanced chorus, and sometimes with audience as well. But certainly, I think the short term, there'll be naturally more of a focus on smaller scale works, and perhaps those that don't require orchestra and the rest. But I'm optimistic that it can happen if we get to that stage of our roadmap where we can allow audiences in and we can have concerts. But it poses big financial questions because, as everyone knows, you can't fill a concert hall at the moment, and with a concert hall that fills with perhaps only 20% of its normal seats, there's no way that they can make that work financially. So it's tough. Without governmental support, it's very bleak.
Yes. Yeah.
There's the possibility that, I've been thinking about how one could recast some of these larger scale works, reduced orchestrations, that sort of thing. And of course, the kind of big choruses mentioned in the question, back in the day, you often went to your local choral union and were accompanied by organ in the big blockbusters, so that there's probably a middle ground somewhere with reduced orchestrations, and the idea of making stuff available to print off on the internet, that I think publishers might actually start to think about new ways of disseminating music in different versions. And that may be something that comes out of it. But I think that's not to replace the idea that eventually you want your Gerontius with the Philharmonia and everybody else,
There will be a real sense of return, won't there?
Yeah.
When people sing their first Gerontius again.
Dusting off,
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, talking of those sorts of returns, I do have some really general questions that are coming up now. One from Sally Dorr, who says, what is the most uplifting moment involving music in your respective tenures as director of music? Matthew, I'm going to start with you on that one. Gets us way, way away from some of the depressing talk that we've had tonight.
So this is not my current.
I think your tenure as a director of music, wherever.
Gosh, I think it has to be, and it was fairly recently. It was in Keble, the Keble Early Music Festival, which is a festival I started when I arrived, and the first big concert I did to close that festival was a massed choir, a version of the Mass in B minor, involving lots of college choirs. And I think that was something I found, to be, it's the first time I'd conducted the piece. And so it was, I'd say that was probably one of the most uplifting moments for me, to see all of the students come together and perform a piece which I think, I'd say most of them didn't know it. And we had the opportunity for several rehearsals in advance, which most of them turned up to. And to actually, see in their eyes, when it all came together, because obviously the first rehearsal wasn't, massively encouraging. But to see the whole thing come together and to see that, them experience this music really for the first time, I'd say that was a great thing for the students. And I know that in Cambridge, there are many more of these kind of intercollegiate events, but that was a really wonderful thing to do.
That would be the intercollegiate events that you were talking about was last year. I conducted the War Requiem in here with 4 of the Cambridge choirs and the Cambridge orchestras, and like Matthew says, sometimes I sometimes forget that when you give these scores to these students, you might have lived with this work for however many years, but for lots of them it's the first time they're experiencing it. And there's something completely thrilling about introducing a work that you know and love to a group of, like I was saying earlier, those hungry individuals, and the way that they view a score like that with no preconceptions, it's extraordinarily refreshing. And certainly that collegiality of joining, many choirs together and orchestras, that was a great and loud moment.
Yes. Daniel.
Well, I have some of those experiences coming up in my mind as well, but actually thinking most recently, since being back in Cambridge and revisiting this space after nearly 20 years, it's actually the smallest thing which can sometimes be the most uplifting. And hopefully there may be a few occasions like that when we're not allowed to sing very loudly, but in this space, something perfectly tuned, perfectly turned out and very soft, probably at the West Door on Christmas Eve. I think that was one of those moments for me where I thought, we've worked jolly hard at this. And, it's been a difficult term as it was. And you could hear a pin drop. And it's those slightly more intimate musical moments within a huge space that I think of, and it's almost like I don't remember the exact instance because it might have caught me completely by surprise. Might have just been the verse of a psalm in everyday life. It might not have been a big concert, but it's just those small moments. And of course, I've got some of the big moments as well where you just think, yeah, that was great, you know.
But it's that precious thing, isn't it?
It's when you've taught the group of people, you've kind of carried them along. You haven't cajoled, you've kind of enabled them to do something, and then because they're very talented and capable, and they know that when, you know, the moment is there, they're going to deliver. You can just see this sort of, you can see this thing in the air, if that makes any sense, that something's going to happen. And it's a very Cambridge experience, and it's very precious.
It's funny, I think because I'm getting old, there's probably a lot, and there are probably lots of things, lots of times that you know, I've forgotten. But I think, just as you guys were answering, I remember once, and this wasn't even in Cambridge, I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and it was the first time I conducted, to bring this conversation around, Speminalium, and it was with lots of singers from around the area. And we thought at the time that it was probably the first performance of Speminalium east of Montreal. And I will never forget what it felt like for that respice moment. That was cool. But you know, even yesterday with my choir, with 70% of them brand new, we read through the Kyrie of the Jerusalem Requiem, which, you know, I do it every year, but every time, and, you know, and I said to them, how many of you have sung this? And, you know, two hands went up really excitedly, and the rest were like, you know, and you could just see the look in their eye, and it's just so good, you know. It's sort of, it's not even they actually read it very well, and it's not even like last night's run through of it was this great moment, but it's just, that music is unbelievable.
And there's a moment when they get it.
Yep.
And it can take time, can't
And
it?
it was also, you know, that sort of live music making in that chapel, which, you know, hasn't got much more acoustic than you do, but that's, you know, it's there was something about that just, it was a bit magic. So.
Now, Daniel, you mentioned the famous word Christmas Eve. And there are various questions coming up here about whether Carols from Kings is likely to be virtual or real this year, and several other questions about when services are going to be live again.
Well, I can tell you that at the moment, the plans are well underway for the usual filming of Carols from Kings, which is the television service. It will probably be without a congregation. That's the decision at the moment. That means that we can make the space safe, and also cameras can go in unusual positions in order to keep people suitably distanced. So it could actually be quite cool to get completely different views of this space. And then the 9 lessons and carols on Christmas Eve, unless we can't be here, unless we get shut down for whatever reason, the intention is to do it, but probably without a congregation, or if we have been able to have some congregation, it would probably be very limited to the college community or something like that. But that's the #1 priority in this chapel. I think, as we were saying earlier, you know, we were talking about what we may or may not be able to do. For us, it's a case of starting to prepare for Christmas now, to have sort of money in the bank in case, you know, we need to draw on the savings account when the time comes. But who knows? It'll be a wonderful thing if we can, because I think it's not just for King's College, it sort of represents choral Cambridge in a way that it would be a great beacon of sort of hope and, you know, fulfillment to present something. And of course, also for a number of kind of cathedral style choirs. Of course, we don't just talk about our collegiate choirs, but for cathedral choirs that are not going to be able to get going in the way that we can. Perhaps their choir school isn't residential, they can't have children in the same bubble, those sorts of things. I hope that we will be able to do something positive that will help people to enjoy Christmas, especially if we're all stuck at home.
Thank you. And a more general one about Christmas from Jimmy DeBoo, who says, many local church choirs will be turning their minds to Christmas and assuming we still cannot sing together, but will put together videos. Can you share any thoughts on ideal choices of carols?
Something with a simple meter that can be easily put together and
doesn't move around.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that's got a kind of sense of rigidity to it, and it's the same old mantra. You know, a simple piece done really well is always more impressive than a difficult piece done badly, and choose a piece that you love. And at the end of the day, I don't think it particularly matters if it's not pristine. I think perhaps maybe we're getting to that point now that we've done 6 months of these, and it's been great and it's brought communities together. But I think actually it's important that we do it because we want to do it, not because it's the right thing to do. And so choose a piece that you particularly enjoy.
And smaller ones, you know, there's nothing wrong with singing in unison, and particularly with carols. And I remember last year, it was a very, very last minute thing. In order to raise a little bit of money for one of the choir tours that didn't happen, I took the Ely girl choristers out to the Christmas market at the last minute in Santa hats and cassocks. And we had no music with us. We just, you know, decided to go and sing, and with a bucket. And they made a couple £100 actually. It was quite impressive. But they just sang familiar carols like Away in a Manger and stuff in unison. And, you know, a couple of them sang in parallel thirds from time to time, which sounded terribly impressive. But, you know, especially at Christmas, the melodies kind of stand alone, and you don't need to do anything too clever to them.
There's a book, the Penguin Book of Carols, that I was looking at earlier this week, and there are loads of, you can get it for about 60p on ABE Books. There are loads of worthwhile things in that book which actually shed light on where a lot of the arrangements and the sort of carol versions, let's call it, that we all think of as being that carol. In some of these volumes, you can see where the original ideas came from, and stripping back to that, I think, is no bad thing. You know, simple 4-part arrangements without too much flour and yeast is a good thing.
Do you know the University Carol book?
The very old one.
Yeah, it's edited by, is it Eric Routley? And it's like Dan was saying, it's got a lot of the well-known carols, but before Wilcox got to them and made them sound brilliant, but actually add very quickly. But you know, absolutely, they're so simple that's, and it must be out of print, but I do have a copy of it.
Some of them look quite familiar, because of course we all arrange carols, and we arrange with our own kind of context and experience and knowledge. And I think that's something about carols which is, you know, which is one of its sort of unique elements, that is an accretion of all sorts of different ideas. Now is a time to refresh that in a different way, and perhaps pulling it back and finding something very simple could reveal new ideas in time.
It's interesting, this question of simplicity, but also the need to, Graham, you were talking about this with your students, to give them a musical challenge, to give them something to really to get their teeth into. There's a question here about developing, again, going back to the technology question, about developing vocal technique. Jonathan Stewart says, how does the panel try to develop vocal technique in their singers when they can't hear them in Zoom?
I didn't do any of those Zoom rehearsals. I actually don't know. Everything about the way I live my life is about these. I don't think I could have done that, actually.
I think the groups that did do that format, it was as much about keeping continuity. I'm thinking particularly about the kind of choral societies or the choral unions, those kind of ones where you simply couldn't have 100 people singing at you. I think in some senses the continuity was more important than physically being able to hear, I think. And even if in groups of, you know, the choir size that we work with, it still wouldn't work having 30 people singing at you. The best I think you can do is to do individual training, but that's not choral training, that's individual technique.
Gets us back to the question of the virtual rehearsal and the extent to which the virtual rehearsal might or might not work, particularly if you're thinking about blend.
There's a colleague of mine, a very close friend and former colleague in Oxford, who runs the Oxford Bach Choir. He actually commissioned some videos from a couple of singing teachers as sort of warm-up routines, call it that. And I saw a few of these and thought that's quite a useful bolt-on to, you know, singing teachers who are able to give a flavor of what they do, but actually play the piano. So you can kind of do, it's a bit like doing a Pilates, I'm told, doing a Pilates warm-up on the sitting room floor, you know, with some nice Australian telling you what to do, you know. You could do the same for vocal training, but I don't think you can do it in any kind of Zoom rehearsal with more than 2 people in the room, so to speak. I managed it with 2 choristers at a time, but you know, you're not hearing the same thing. It comes back to what Sarah said. They need to be able to hear, you need to be able to hear them, and that's the elephant in the room.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose one might be able to hear balance, but not vocal tone and tone quality.
Yeah, and also, you know, it might sound a bit scratchy or a bit wiry, and that might actually be the connection, rather than, you know, the child singing to you. And you don't want to say the wrong thing, because they might already be feeling self-conscious. It's maybe something that just has to be on ice for a little bit, just to keep the enthusiasm there and the commitment as the priority.
Yeah. Quite more questions about repertoire. Hilary Perrott says, are you commissioning new choral pieces that reflect current circumstances?
I'm not personally, but I know that some people have been. People have been writing things for kind of distanced. Didn't you write a piece, Sarah? For,
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
I wrote a Zoom anthem,
Yeah.
which it was quite fun, actually. It was an acrostic of verses from the Psalms, and the acrostic spelled quarantine. And it was for 14 singers, and to be sung 1 line at a time. And it works in, there are 2 different melodies that change, the rhythm changes according to what, you know, the words. And it's called, the first line is "Quicken me, O Lord," and, you know, it goes through, and I managed to get the word plague in there. I was really pleased with that. And basically each of the melodies works in canon with itself, and the whole thing works as a 40-part canon, or you can do it as a 2-part canon or a 4-part canon. I actually multi-tracked the 40-part canon. It's a bit sort of Thomas Tallis meets Steve Reich. And, you know, it's funny what you were saying. I mean, I found that was quite fun to you know, I find the more constraints I get asked for, the more likely I am to be able to compose something. And I really, that sort of constraint. And that particular was so, I even took, I take photographs in my spare time, and I took a load of my photographs of Candlemas at Ely last year and uploaded them so that you could put a virtual Zoom background of candles, of my candle photographs, so that you could then sing this piece so it looked like virtual Compline.
It's like having a fire on the screen, isn't it? Yeah.
I think on that note, we're pretty much coming up to time, but it's emblematic of the sheer creativity, I think, that we've got in this room, with 4 directors of music who have reinvented their jobs over the last several months. I'd like to thank you all very warmly for your contributions and your willingness to come and talk. I'd like to thank the audience. There are, I think, nearly 600 of you out there. Thank you very much for your contributions and questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to include everybody's question. I hope that those of you whose questions were answered, you feel that you were answered fully and candidly and usefully. I think you probably were. I should just remind you in closing that this session has been recorded and it will be posted on YouTube, and wish you, from myself and from the panelists, an absolutely fantastic alumni festival for the rest of the weekend. Thank you very much.